It is my great pleasure to introduce our last speaker for the day. I want to pay tribute to those hardy souls. The crowd's thinned a bit like my hairline over the day, but we kept the quality for the cream of the crop for last. Catherine King, the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government, a veteran Parliament, first elected in 2001, one of Albo's most trusted lieutenants. She's in Albo's portfolio of infrastructure, never an easy gig. I said it's like being Keating's treasurer. I think the greatest compliment anyone could pay to the Minister was in speaking to Albo said, "I've handed it over, she's got this," which I never thought I'd ever heard him say about infrastructure. And that's because of the respect is played in the partnership they've formed through opposition in taking forward infrastructure. She's particularly the Minister for discovering all the things Barnaby Joyce left behind for her in the Nationals' favourite portfolio. She's still the Minister for uncovering hollow logs and things like that. But in a time when, as we all know, Western Sydney is so dependent on infrastructure, the Minister's in charge. We appreciate your time. We appreciate the announcement this week, which you might talk about the panel leading into next year's budget. Please make welcome Minister Catherine King.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction, Chris. I'm very conscious I'm the last speaker of what has been a very long day, so thank you for hanging in there as well. I'll try and be brief and we'll get to the discussion, and then I'm sure you'll all be keen to head home as well. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we gather, pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And to Chris, I do want to particularly thank you for your continued leadership, not just through the dialogue, but I know that my colleagues and I from the Prime Minister on down appreciate and value the advice and counsel that you give, and I look forward to many future exchanges with you. Before we get into the discussion, I just thought there's a couple of things I wanted to talk about today, and the first is obviously the panel that we announced. It actually was the Prime Minister who was going to announce it on my behalf, on his behalf, and I ended up doing it as he is unwell. And also a little bit about the Infrastructure Australia review and government response, which we've also handled down today. Of course, I am acutely conscious of just how important Western Sydney is to the overall national economy. You are home to 1 in every 11 Australians, with residents born in over 170 different countries, First Nations communities that have deep connections to the country, incredibly diverse environment with over $600 million worth of food bowl alone, World Heritage listed national park, the most important river system in the state, and open spaces that Sydney-siders and their families use from the state over. You're really the beating heart of modern multicultural Australia. You've got a long and deep history as well, and all of that plays into the complexity of place when we start to talk about things that sit within my portfolio around transport, infrastructure, economic development in the smaller towns to larger economic development opportunities that both Western Sydney Airport and also the intermodal poses for the area. It's undergoing the most rapid transformation, but again, it is not consistent across the whole of Western Sydney. There are different areas, and again, I think really understanding that complexity. The advantage and disadvantage I have to some extent is, you have as an outsider an observer status often that is quite unique when you're not from a place. But also being from a place means you also have an incredible depth of knowledge. So trying to bring that together is really what I've tried to do with the panel. It's me as Minister, with an observer status of a region that I know lots about in terms of what I see, what our investments are, but also having a panel that's actually going to be able to advise me around particularly transport infrastructure, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. There's a bit that we put into the election campaign in terms of the area. So Chris was absolutely adamant about us starting the work for the Castlereagh connector, and I've probably said that wrong because I'm a Victorian, so I've gone, not instead of Castlereagh, I've said Castlereagh, so I always do that. I get my staff tell me off every time I do it because most of them are from New South Wales. So accelerating construction on Dunheved Road, M12 motorway, of course Western Sydney Airport, and the money, the 5 point or so billion that's going into the airport connections for rail as well. Importantly, as I said, we're wanting to set the future stage, and that's really what the announcement we made about the panel at the Bradfield oration just a few days ago. Really what I'm after is a body that's going to provide me with some strategic assessment of the needs and opportunities of transport infrastructure across the West. I haven't constrained it. I know there's some talk, which we could talk about, that it's constrained to certain local government areas. I haven't actually done that. There's obviously 10 LGAs that are sort of the core focus, but I haven't constrained it to that. I have a broader view about what I'm looking for from the panel. I'm hoping to take, which is always a very ambitious thing to do as a politician, but I am hoping to take some of the politics out of it, and particularly sort of some of the sort of more federal and state politics. I know I had one of my state counterparts up there. It's one of the things that I'm hoping that I bring is, I've learnt basically at the feet of the Prime Minister about building consensus and what you actually have to do and the work you have to do that, and that means sometimes leaving some of that Commonwealth state politics and argy-bargy out of the public domain and trying to actually work closely together where you can and not getting into too many stoushes, and that's certainly the approach that I try and take. I'm certainly hoping that alongside Infrastructure Australia, the panel will report to me ahead of the 23-24 budget. That's not its end of its job, but with the priorities for transport infrastructure investment for the next decade for this area. It's not our usual approach to transport infrastructure, but what I've learnt over my short time as Infrastructure Minister is that the complexity of Western Sydney does need a bit of a different approach, one that builds on the long history of place-based decision-making that exists here, draws together the very different challenges of each area of Western Sydney and attempts to build a consensus of priorities across levels of government to assist with investment and future decisions, and I look forward to working with the panel to this end. Today I've also released the report and the government's response into the review of Infrastructure Australia. It was established by the now Prime Minister in the last Labor government to really provide independent expert advice to the Commonwealth on the infrastructure investment Australians need for a better future, but a decade has left it, frankly, in need of some significant renewal. We need to ask, and I asked when I came into government, what are those genuinely transformational nation-building projects in each of the states and territories or across the nation that we need to invest in the next 10 to 20 years? How do we ensure that these projects actually produce and enhance productivity dividends that we so desperately need as we move out of COVID? And so we needed to revisit how Infrastructure Australia works with each of the infrastructure bodies that have emerged over the decade with each of the states and territories as well. And to answer that question, I of course asked Nicole Lockwood and Mike Murdoch, who are, particularly Mike, who's well known to you here, to conduct an independent review. The review recommended that Infrastructure Australia needed to produce a smaller, more refined, targeted infrastructure priority list. It currently sits at around about 155, and I haven't actually added up the dollar amount of all of those projects, but it's beyond any one level of government to ever fund, basically. I think I'd be fair in saying that. Develop a national planning and assessment framework to support national consistency in infrastructure assessment. Adopt a more active role in the post-completion stage of infrastructure. It's one of the pieces of advice we've constantly been getting, that we don't really look at what are the lessons learned nationally from those investments and how do we actually do things better, and Infrastructure Australia needs to have a role in that. And also to adopt a structure that brings together and works more closely with each of the infrastructure bodies. We've agreed as a result of that there will be a shorter, smaller targeted priority list that will lead to very specific targeted advice to government in the lead up to each budget cycle. Formal responses to Infrastructure Australia's advice and findings and recommendations will be more consistently published. We can't do all of them. There are some that will be part of budget processes, so that makes it a little difficult to do those, but trying to make sure government is more transparent about how it's responding to its advice. Developing, as I said, a national planning and assessment framework, have a more active role in post-completion, and also, as I said, we'll be replacing the board over time with a commissioner, 3 full-time commissioners with an advisory board underneath as well, with the capacity to undertake inquiries into broader scale issues, so things like, where are the gaps in the National Freight Task, how do all of the new intermodals that are part of Inland Rail and part of the entire network help contribute to the National Freight Task, Where are we up to in terms of our national port strategy? Are we actually, given there's been such a large-scale privatisation in some states, where are we able to leverage productivity in relation to some of those that freight task as well? So a whole range of issues it could potentially inquire into. Most of these changes will require legislative change, so there is a transition that will need to occur as well. So we expect that that's going to take some time. So I'm very pleased that we've actually announced, I've used Boomtown as an opportunity to actually launch and announce that response. It's been long awaited in our first 6 months, and it's something that I'm proud that we've been able to actually start to deliver on and to actually get that body back to being what it should be, as the preeminent advisory body to the federal government for the investments we make in infrastructure. And that includes not just across the country, but of course here in the West. Thank you for having me, and I'm happy to enter into the discussion, somewhat nervously if he's going to make me only do 45 seconds now, given I can talk underwater, because I'm a politician and that's what we do sometimes. Thanks very much for having me.